Hope this devotion finds you well. This week we'll be in Isaiah chapter 35. The last few weeks I've been reading in Isaiah, and I'm not going to lie, some of the days of my reading have been a challenge. Isaiah's time was a time of decline, apathy, and outside threats. And in some ways it mirrors our own world today, although the decline in Isaiah's time was more prolonged. As I read Isaiah's calls of judgment against God's people, I've prayed to God, God, my world is really messed up right now, and I need to hear something from you. And then you read in your devotion about God's coming judgment on Assyria or Sidon, about how God will fill their cities with owls and hyenas. So it's kind of hard to make sense of. But then there are days where Isaiah tells not of judgment for abandoning God, but of hope. And more importantly, hope even in the judgment. He tells of a Messiah, of our relationship with God restored and a new and better kingdom, that there is a day coming, he writes often. And so today I'd just like to share with you a little bit of Isaiah 35. It's just 10 verses. The desert and the parched land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus, it will burst into bloom. It will rejoice greatly and shout for joy. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord, the splendor of our God. Strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees that give way. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save you. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then the lame leap like a deer, and the mute tongues shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The burning sand will become a pool, the thirsty ground bubbling springs. In the haunts where jackals once lay, grass and reeds and papyrus will grow, and a highway will be there. It will be called the way of holiness. It will be for those who walk on that way. The unclean will not journey on it. Wicked fools will not go about on it. No lion will be there, nor will any ravenous beast. They will not be found there. But only the redeemed will walk there, and those the Lord has rescued will return. They will enter Zion with singing. Everlasting joy will crown their heads. Gladness and joy will overtake them, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. Now, in context, this passage doesn't make a lot of sense. In the previous chapter, the Lord is enraged against the nations and their wickedness and is going to destroy them. It talks about their dead bodies will pile up and the stink up the place, and the mountains will be soaked with their blood. The skies will dissolve. Stars will fall out of the sky. Animals will die. The whole place will burn. It's just this wilderness of chaos that's going to happen in chapter 34. But in 35, there's imagery that shouts blessing. Isaiah compares what will be to Lebanon, a land known for its beautiful forest, and to Carmel and Sharon, places known for their fertile soil. So here what Isaiah is saying is that hope is happening. They will see the glory of the Lord and the majesty of God. And then verse 4, this passage has some brilliant poetry going on in it. It doesn't rhyme. Hebrew poetry doesn't rhyme, but has parallel thoughts that are echoed throughout. And the point to all that it's leading to is this central thought in verse 4 is be strong and do not fear. God is coming. He will come to save you. And the next few verses tell us what will come about because of those commands. And the end of the chapter tells us how life will be, that people will be traveling down a highway of holiness leading to God's city itself. As God restores the land and turns the desert into a garden, we are invited to join the journey with God. We are invited to tell others about how the story of despair and desolation is being turned into a story of hope and joy. Be strong and do not fear. Here is your God. Even in the desert wasteland of death, it's not too far gone for God to find it in redemption, which Isaiah brings to mind the image of a crocus growing in the desert. And on this journey, we see that blind eyes will be opened and deaf ears will hear and lame will walk and so on and so on. And this is kind of parallel in the Gospels. In Matthew chapter 11, Jesus indirectly alludes to Isaiah 35 when the imprisoned John the Baptist sends his followers to ask Jesus if he is the promised one. And Jesus replies to their questioning by telling them, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are being cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is being proclaimed to the poor." In other words, tell them everything that Isaiah said would happen is happening. And by alluding to Isaiah 35, it's almost as if Jesus is telling John the Baptist, "Be strong and do not fear." And we can do the same. We can call out to others to join us. Here's God. Look at what God is doing in this wasteland. Even in this mess, there's a garden springing up. Our God is in the business of making life out of death. And God speaks life and hope into a desert. It's as if God is saying to his people, then and now, it won't always be like this. There's a day coming. So Isaiah 34 speaks of death and destruction, but 35 speaks of life and hope and of joy and holiness. And our God is in the business of resurrection, and that's why those which thought were to be dead are able to find new and abundant life in Jesus. And as we hear the words of Isaiah today, we can give thanks that our God has come to save us, that Jesus came to die for all of our sins and to save us for all of eternity. And now we can look forward to heaven where there's never any deaf ears or mute tongues or lame legs. Only perfection and joy await God's redeemed people. So I hope that word blesses you today. And Isaiah says, be strong and do not fear. Godspeed.